This short presentation gives a very abbreviated account of a project that we are running within our own veterinary practice in the southwest of England. It is not intended as a scientific study, but a clinical concept to try and eradicate an endemic bovine tuberculosis infection in a large dairy herd. And we've utilized some novel testing systems to identify infected and infectious cattle. I've got to make it clear that the project has been conducted with the permission of both the farmer, the veterinary authorities, because in the UK, tuberculosis is under state control, and with the generous help of the University of Warwick, the University of Nottingham, and IDEX Laboratories, and the Save Me Trust. So our problem in the southwest of England, which is where my veterinary practice is, shown in the red circle in the middle of Devonshire, is that we have a very high prevalence of bovine tuberculosis. At any one time, about 18% of all our cattle herds are under restriction and infected with bovine tuberculosis. We have nearly 5,000 cattle herds in the county of Devonshire, and each year about 800 become new breakdowns, are newly infected with the disease. But there is a hard core of persistently infected herds that are chronically infected, defined as being infected and testing positive for more than 18 months. And out of those 5,000 cattle herds, in fact, only 69 fall into this category. And our hypothesis is that these chronically infected herds, which tend to be large dairy herds, act as the reservoir of infection from which the infection seeds out to those other 800 herds which become infected. So our challenge from a veterinary point of view is to deal with these chronically infected, persistently infected large dairy herds. You can see from the red circle a disproportionate number of them are within my practice area, and we've become rather paranoid that we may be doing something wrong. If we tackle a chronic infection such as tuberculosis, bovine tuberculosis, from a veterinary point of view rather than a statutory point of view, what we're really interested in is to find animals that are infectious and have the ability to transmit the disease. We are not particularly interested in animals that are simply infected. If they don't get a chance to transmit the disease, they will carry the disease through their lifetime, not causing anybody or anything any harm, and the disease will die with them. So we use, or have used, a model that we use for the control of Johne's disease and have applied it to bovine tuberculosis. So the statutory testing programs are really set up to identify infected herds and then implement a control program. And it may be that the failure of the control program in these persistently infected herds is simply because we have failed to identify the infectious animals with the current testing programs. So if we look at disease surveillance for tuberculosis, almost worldwide, as Richard Whittington pointed out this morning, we use a single intradermal comparative cervical tuberculin test, otherwise known as the skin test. This has a sensitivity of anywhere between 50 and 80%, depending on who writes the paper, how well the test is done, and the gold standard to which they measure it. But really what it means is that for every 10 infected cows out there, we'll only find 5 or 8 of them, and we'll leave 5 or 2 behind in the herd after each skin test. In small herds with low risks of spread, this may not be too significant, but in large herds with high contact rates and high risks of spread, this is probably some significance. We can increase the sensitivity of the comparative skin test simply by ignoring the comparative part of it and only use the reaction to bovine tuberculin. But this is at the price of specificity. So a government who is paying compensation would err on the side of specificity rather than sensitivity, but from a disease control program point of view, we would really like sensitivity and not worry too much about specificity. So we asked ourselves, is there a way that we can use other tests to try and improve this situation? The farm under the trial is Gatcombe Farm. It's become known as the Gatcombe Project. This comprises about 1,000 to 1,100 cattle, of which 340 are high-yielding Holstein Friesians, which are housed continuously in 5 barns and milked by Lely astronaut robots. It's a very high-yielding, intensive, well-managed herd. In fact, every other infectious disease has been properly controlled and properly managed, which gives the high level of health and productivity which you'd expect from a farm of this size and this level of performance. But we've had tuberculosis circulating in the herd for the past 10 years. And this chart shows the number of reactors, which are officially classified as infected cattle, at each test. We put vets onto this farm every 2 months and skin test all 1,100 cattle. And these are the numbers of reactors that we found over the years. Not huge numbers, but the major cost to the farm is that whilst we find those reactors, he is imposed with movement restrictions and trading restrictions which cost him dearly. He gets compensation for those animals that are slaughtered as reactors, but no consequential loss compensation for the trading impositions that are put on him, which he estimates cost him between 60 and 80,000 euros or pounds per year. So this is a significant economic loss to the farmer. What we've done is effectively tried to enhance the statutory testing program by using some new tests, novel testing systems. So we improved the sensitivity of the current skin testing program by classifying any animal that has, in its lifetime, ever shown any form of bovine reaction to the skin test. This is a mobile population. When we test cattle every 60 days, we often find that they'll react to the bovine tuberculin at one test, but thereafter not react again. So we use a lifetime history. Any animal that's ever had any form of palpable reaction more than 2 millimeters to the bovine skin tuberculin injection is classified as a high-risk cow. That animal then enters an enhanced testing program. And the enhanced testing program means that every 2 months, a blood sample is taken and a fecal sample is taken. The blood sample is tested using a novel system called Actiphage, which uses phage viruses which are specific for Mycobacterium bovis and can be used as a very sensitive indicator of the presence of the organism inside macrophages. So the processing of the sample requires the smashing of the macrophages, the release of the organism, infected with phage, and then if the phage managed to grow, then the organism must be present. It is very sensitive and very specific. That will tell us whether the animal's infected. What we're really interested in is to whether it's infectious. So at the start of the program, we took samples from both ends of the cow. We took saliva samples and fecal samples from all high-risk cattle. Taking saliva samples from cows is not easy. It's quite difficult to find volunteer vets to stick their hands down the back of a cow's throat to get 5 mils of saliva. And in all the samples that we took, we never found a positive. So we resorted just to taking fecal samples. The fecal samples are tested using an RD4 qPCR test, which is a standard test for the detection of Mycobacterium bovis, and done by Warwick University. What we're really looking for in that is animals that are infected and infectious, that is, shedding the organism in their feces. What we do with those cattle, once we find shedders, is remove them from the herd, but phage-positive infected cattle that are not shedding are retained because of the economics. What we're looking for is a reduction in the number of infected and infectious cattle in the herd, thus reducing the infective load and hopefully eliminating the disease. What we've done since October 2015, when we started this program, and mind you, with 1 year's interruption because it was deemed unlawful by our state veterinary service, so we had to reapply for permissions, but that was granted, and we've now managed to identify 192 high-risk cows through that period. This is a dynamic population. Some join the group, some leave the group. Of those 192 high-risk cows, 154 have been repeatedly phage tested, and 125 have had at least one positive phage test. These are animals that have not been detected by the classic skin test. They are not classified as reactors. That is to say, 81% of the high-risk cows that have been missed by the skin test as reactors or infected are actually infected as determined by the phage test. And we have reasonable confidence in phage. 158 of those 192 high-risk cows have also been fecal PCR tested, and 33 have been identified as shedding detectable organism in their feces. 21% of high-risk cattle become shedders. And interestingly, this is in line with what happens with human tuberculosis. Around 15% of the 2 billion people that Richard talked about earlier this morning become overt infections and shedders. Most of the cows that were previously phage positive, most of the cows that shed were previously phage positive, but 7 actually had never had a phage positive test. The RD4 qPCR claims to have a detection rate of around 1,000 organisms per gram in feces. The sensitivity is low because of the difficulty of purifying feces in the PCR process. And it'd be interesting, one of the talks here earlier in the conference talked about the improvement of processing to improve the sensitivity of the PCR. At the same time as detecting the undisclosed reservoir of infection in the cattle herd, we were also worried about the environmental contamination from the wildlife reservoir. The farm sits in an area which has a very high badger population, not least because of the maize that the farm grows to feed the cows. Warwick University allocated us a PhD student for 3 months, and we surveyed all the badger sets, collected 273 fecal samples from badger latrines, of which 32% were infected with M. bovis, using the RD4 PCR detection system. And in fact, 69% of the latrines had at least one positive sample. You can see on this map, with Gatcombe Farm in the top centre, the red dots indicate badger latrines where 100% of all the latrine samples taken from there were M. bovis positive, creating a significant environmental contamination for grazing cattle. Adult cows never go outside, but young cattle and beef stock do graze and graze in those fields. And the controversy that we're dealing with at the moment, where the badger is seen as the main culprit of TB spread, is that we have never seen a reactor or TB positive case in any of the cattle that are grazed. All the reactors are in animals that have never grazed outside. So this begs the question, over those 100 cattle culled from TB in the last 5 years, and 30% of badger fecal samples positive, who is infecting who? Our likelihood is that the badgers are becoming infected from contaminated slurry fecal matter that is taken from the farm and spread onto those fields on an annual basis. This farm produces 7,000 tonnes of slurry per year, which is, or was at the time, spread onto those pastures. We no longer do that in order to break the infection cycle, and in fact, we are this very week, at this very moment, at home, vaccinating the badger population with BCG to protect them. So, what's happened? The good news is that we have seen the number of high-risk cattle falling month on month, and now the farm has tested clear. The farm is now, for the first time in 10 years, officially TB-free. What we think we have demonstrated is that through good veterinary practice, the use of enhanced testing programs, we can identify infectious animals and stop them spreading this disease to susceptibles. What we have to emphasize that testing alone will not solve the problem. We have introduced strict management practices to identify infectious animals and stop them from spreading it to susceptibles. So risk management, biosecurity and biocontainment is essential. And I think this is a lesson where we can probably apply these processes with the right permissions onto those 69 persistently infected herds in Devon and hopefully tackle the real reservoir of infection which exists in the county. Thank you.